Hi everyone, I hope you're having a good day and a good week so far, albeit it's only Tuesday. But I thought I'd do a quick live for about 30 minutes to talk about, your conflict style and conflict, a bit about conflict. And the reason is because unfortunately it does come up quite a lot in my coaching sessions and with my coaching clients. And sometimes it's actually about understanding that there is a conflict in place in the first place, or a difference in communication styles. There's many different reasons for conflict, which I'll go into in a bit. I've also got some slides just to go through some of the points I wanted to make today, but it is a really, I'd hate to use the word popular, but common, and very often as human beings, I think many of us, not all of us, but many of us tend to shy away from conflict or confrontation. Whereas if you can perhaps view it as an opportunity to clarify and to communicate, perhaps that could take the sting out of that word, because conflict sounds like a big, serious word, as does confrontation. Whereas if we're communicating and working together as citizens in an organization, as allies in an organization, perhaps if we can reframe it in our minds and see that there is a positive upside to dealing with conflict. So let me just move my slides along. So I hope you can see these numbers. I quite often quote these numbers when I'm giving presentations to organizations, when I'm running masterminds or coaching groups or workshops in-house, or working with individuals to demonstrate how much conflict can actually cost. And that's in both financial terms, in terms of overall performance of the organization, but also, and most importantly, in terms of people. It costs about a third of somebody's overall package, remuneration package and benefits, to replace somebody. And it takes a number of months to get somebody upskilled. But also, in a world where we're all very socially connected, where there's new models of leadership emerging, such as authentic leadership, conscious leadership, which means working together as an ally with external stakeholders, with your employees, to drive the growth of the business. When we're looking at diversity and inclusion and equity, all of these must align to the fact that we should be able to deal with conflict in a healthy manner. I say should, but sometimes we don't. And that's not to blame anyone. It's just the nature of human beings that sometimes we tend to avoid conflict. But as you can see here, there's some quite big numbers here, whether you're a large organization or a smaller organization, because what tends to happen is that the day-to-day running of the team can become disrupted. Activities slow down. People start to second guess their behaviors. People become a bit more hesitant about what they're doing and what they're saying, and perhaps lose some resilience and confidence, which is a lot of the work that I do. I'm working with a lot of leaders at the moment that have broadened their scope, grown their teams, be it from 10 to 20 to 60 to 80 plus, and really dealing with a new team, an enlarged team, understanding the different styles, and really picking up some unresolved issues can be incredibly challenging. So it is very common, and it can slow down those team processes. It can really get in the way of innovation, because if you've got a team that's demotivated, they're not feeling positively influenced by the organization, or they don't feel that they can speak up, or they've got unresolved issues or conflicts, then people tend to remain quiet. They won't speak up. The motivation goes, it disappears, because people aren't really being listened to or seen. Now, again, this isn't a blame game. A lot of it's about human behavior, how we are very attuned as human beings to detect threat and danger. That's our sort of programming from evolution and some of our evolutionary cycles. So we do have that negativity bias, which sometimes makes us a bit afraid to address certain conflicts. But needless to say, It can really disrupt teams. It can really disrupt organizations, innovation, progress, productivity, relationships with people. The people in your organization might be working with customers. It could disrupt those. So it does have a big impact across many, many different layers. And really, before I go into a couple of case studies, why does this happen? Well, I've already talked about the fact that some of it is in our human behaviors, the fact that we see conflict and confrontation as almost bad words. And they can be bad if they escalate. And if we're talking about bullying or harassment, then of course that has to be dealt with in the right way. That's not what I'm talking about here today. But what tends to happen, some of the symptoms I've seen, and these symptoms lead to lack of morale, lack of performance, burnout, and stress. I'm working with several people at the moment who are burning out and stressed because they just don't know how to deal with different situations, but they can be resolved. It's often about unclear role profiles and goals. It can be, I'm afraid to say, about poor leadership. Are you communicating with your team? Are you providing that open culture for feedback? Are you recognizing misunderstandings or miscommunications early enough, which means you probably are quite good at dealing with conflict and conflict resolution? Are you spotting those signs early enough? Are you working with your team to provide that dynamic of, speaking openly, giving feedback, working together on a vision, on an execution strategy to really pinpoint what some of those stresses might be? Also, what happens is that when there are changes within a team will go through a natural life cycle. That change can be changes to the wider organization. That is a bit of a hot topic when it comes to conflict. It can be changes to your team, a new team member, increased scope. It can even be working across a work stream or a project work stream, or being what we call a fractional leader, where you have some of your time allocated to temporarily looking after a team. So there's a lot about team dynamics that come into play around changes, be that to roles, be that to activities, be that to, T's and C's, bigger things, big corporate changes or smaller changes, or the company going in a different direction. Now, communications can help resolve a lot of those. And my past background is in communications and change communication. So I've worked a lot in that area and dealing with some of these areas before I got into coaching. So there's many, many different reasons. I'm going to come on to personality clashes, because it can be good old-fashioned personality clashes. So just to touch a bit on my experience, 25 years in corporate life, working with DHL, working with some fantastic organizations, the NHS, AstraZeneca, Abbott, to name a few. A very broad history in medical devices and pharmaceuticals. I worked in communications, as I mentioned, government affairs, internal communications, external communications, and patient advocacy. So my role was really about dealing with issues head on, because as a communications person, we don't really want to be hiding from them. We want to understand, when do we respond, when don't we respond? And my role was very much about influencing and understanding other people. So moving to coaching was a natural fit. And I work with organizations in biopharma, I've worked in property, consumer, many different sectors. And I work as an associate for the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association. If you're going to be at the European Leadership Summit in Milan this week, say hello. I did a post on that today on LinkedIn on Tuesday, so my phone number's in there. So if you are at that meeting, please say hello. But anyway, back to some case studies. That's a bit about my background. I worked in a team where many of the personality styles are very similar. And one might think, well, that's great because they understand each other. To a certain extent, yes. And I'll come on to that in a bit. But sometimes what I found was that because the styles were so similar, people were doing the same behaviors, enacting the same behaviors when it came to conflict. So, for example, there are particular styles that do not feel comfortable opening up and talking about what's on their mind. And I'll come on to that in a minute. And the problem with the team I was working with, and again, it was in a biopharma company, a very successful one, was that nobody was speaking up about the pressures within the team. Now, the leader of the team could see there were issues, that could see there were tensions, but because all of the immediate team had the similar style, they weren't really comfortable, felt that they had permission to speak up, it just built and built and built. So I came in to really look at their personality profiles, do a conflict map about, okay, let's talk about this. Let's do a bit of a SWOT analysis and see what's going on. So that's one example. I've also worked with a team recently who are looking to grow and looking to develop. And I've taken them through the team dynamics model where any little change can disrupt the team and cause conflict. So we've mapped out what is the process your team is going to go on? Where's the talent already in your team? Going into this new area, what particular styles of people or attributes might you need? And what knock-on effect will that have within your existing team? And what does that mean in terms of recruitment? So that was more of a conflict. I don't want to use the word avoidance, but a recognition of some of the changes that were coming down the track. So there's a couple of examples for you there. Now, this is a classic model in terms of conflict management. As you can see, and hopefully you can see the slides very well, there's different axes there where at the top, you've got a more assertive approach to conflict. And at the bottom, you've got a less assertive approach to conflict. This is a very recognized conflict management, conflict resolution model. And within that, you've got 4 boxes. And you can see that each of those boxes has got an example of what that means and what it could look like in the real world. And again, I mentioned personality styles. I'm going to go through in a minute some of the typical personality styles and how they deal with conflict typically. I don't want to label people too much, but I'll give you some clues to certain behaviours. So what we can see here is that in the middle, we've got very much a compromising style. Let's meet in the middle. Can we meet in the middle? Can we get to a win-win? What I would say about compromise is that I wouldn't compromise on something that you're not prepared to give up or choose to give up. Now, that doesn't mean that we become stubborn or fixed. We must listen to other people when we're going through conflict or disagreements. However, is there a way that we can meet in the middle? Can we use a bit of cooperation and a bit of assertiveness to get to a win-win situation? And that win-win might, it would be impossible to go through the parameters of what that would look like, but perhaps it's about how quickly you move on a project, what data you need to make decisions, when you bring new people into the team, or something, bigger or more different than that in terms of a strategic direction for the company. Now, sometimes that might not be possible. Sometimes you might have to come back to the conversation several times because picking the right time, the right place, the right environment is super important. And choosing whether you have somebody there to help you is also important. But hopefully you can work through conflicts together, the 2 of you or however many people it is. So you might have to have several goes at this. One technique I particularly like is if you're feeling a bit stuck when it comes to compromising, is that what you could do is have a bit of discussion around, okay, let's look at all the different scenarios and list them out. Have a list of them and maybe choose A and B, but only choose the A and B solutions that all parties agree on or could live with or could deal with or work around. Sometimes you have to give a little, in our business life and our professional life. So what could be the A and the B solutions? Now, then you look at that and say, okay, we're going to go with A first. If that doesn't work, we'll try B, which is a derivation of A. So I hope that makes sense in terms of, coming together, discussing it, coming up with different solutions, and then picking an A, B, and possibly a C. But as you can see, there's 4 other boxes, and maybe you can recognize your style in conflict here. If you've had some psychometric profiling done, there might also be some clues in your insights profile, your DISC profile, your Myers-Briggs about how you deal with conflict. Are you more reserved, less assertive, more accommodating, or you're more assertive, perhaps even veering towards aggression, which is what we don't want. Being assertive is that healthy middle space. Some people confuse assertive with being aggressive. Aggressive and assertive are very different things. Being passive doesn't really work because we might say yes to things that we don't really agree with just to keep the peace. And then we end up taking on more work, saying yes to things we don't really agree with, and burning out potentially. I've seen a lot of that with my coaching clients. We might, and that's where typically the avoiding piece comes in, where we're low on assertive list, but we want to cooperate, we want to be loyal, we want to be a team member, not realizing that actually speaking up and being confident and resilient about that is probably the kindest thing you can do for your team rather than keep quiet. I know it's easier said than done. So that's more of that passive response. I talked about the compromising already. That's more of an assertive, healthy response. On the passive side as well, on the bottom, you've got avoiding, where you just don't want to go there. You'll avoid it at all costs. And then accommodating, where, okay, fine, I give up. Let's just do it your way. Now, that's also quite a passive response, not as much as avoiding, but it can be a passive response. Then you've got competing. If we go to the top level now, where we're getting into more assertive territory, we've got competing, where you might get two very dynamic people that are very assertive, but they won't cooperate. They might thrash the problem out, but it doesn't really lead to a solution. And it's about winning, about competition. We need to put all of that aside. We need to put the ego aside and listen actively. We need to listen to what the other person says, summarize it to make sure we've understood, and relay the conversation in that way. Listening, summarizing, asking questions. Then you've got collaborating, where it can be high in assertiveness and high in cooperation. Now, personally, I really like the idea of collaboration in terms of let's work together, let's see what we can do. So you've got these 4 different boxes, and you might see these at different times in different parts of your organization. Compromising is quite a good way to get to that win-win, but also I quite like collaborating. We want to have some level of assertiveness. I don't want you to lose your personalities at all or pretend to be somebody you're not. But if you have to prepare for your discussion, that's fine. Just do it in your own way, but you can be quietly assertive. So assertiveness is that sweet spot. We don't want to go aggressive and we don't want to go too passive. So that's a classic model. And I'm wondering whether you can identify which style you use, or do you use a blend of styles? Have you had a situation where you've perhaps really been triggered and gone into competing, or you've just thought, I can't deal with this person, and avoided the conflict? If you feel happy making a comment on the post that comes with this video, when I post the video, or sending me a DM, feel free to. I'd be really keen to hear. Now, I talked about personality styles. Some of you may have heard of DISC. It's quite similar to Insights in terms of the 4 personality styles that we have here. Now, these letters stand for different things, and I will come on to that in the next slide. But when we talk about DISC, it is DISC. Now, those are the 4 key leading styles or parameters by which DISC measures you, okay? Now, what I don't want us to do is to get into saying, well, you're being very red at the moment, unless you've got a very open culture and you've agreed you can talk like that. I don't want us to over mind read people. I don't want us to label people or judge people for their styles, of course, unless it's bullying and harassment, in which case we must take care of that through the channels and the policies that we have in place. But these are, broadly speaking, the broad styles, okay? Now, underneath these styles, there will be many, many combinations. I think there's over 50, 55 different combinations of, for example, a DCI, an ICD, a CS, an SC. So as you can see, as I'm describing, there are many different blends of styles. But what we've got here are the 4 key parameters of these styles. And why am I talking about this? I'll come on to it in a minute because it really lends itself to conflict management. You've got the D, I call it the red energy. So quite dominant, quite driven, very task focused and outgoing, because it's in that top layer of the circle, which is outgoing, more lending itself to extroversion. So you've got D, very driven, very dominant, quite competitive. When Ds get very When they're under pressure, they can really speed up. They can be very driven and perhaps a little bit too domineering. So that's a watch out for people that are leading or have a high proportion of D or red energy. On the ongoing side, on the yellow quadrant there, we've got the influencing style, which is very outgoing, very bubbly. Relationships, it's all about people and relationships. It's outgoing because it's in the top quadrant, but it's on the right hand side as well, which is people orientated. So whereas DISC is outgoing and task focused, on the right hand side at the top, I is outgoing but people orientated. So there are different blends. So the circle goes top to bottom, left to right. So back to the I style, sometimes called sunshine yellow, very gregarious, very outgoing, great at creating ideas. They're very sociable. They like a bit of small talk. They like building relationships at work. On the flip side, they might be good at starting something and not finishing it. And they can feel quite rejected easily, more easily than other styles. They can be quite sensitive to anything they perceive as criticism. So difficult conversations can be a challenge, but I've coached loads of people around this and we can always learn new skills. At the bottom, you've got the S, the more stabilizing energy. Again, it's on the right-hand side, which means it's a people-orientated style. And at the bottom, it's reserved. So the C and the S, they're very reserved styles. They're much more introvert. And when we're talking about introvert and extroversion, it means how do we process information? How do we process the world around us? So the S is that reserved style. I like to call them the solid green shoots in the earth, perhaps from a tree. I don't know why I think that, but that very sturdy roots of an organization or a team. Super loyal, a little bit sensitive as well, but they're very loyal team members. They're pretty organized. They don't like sudden changes or paces of change. They like a very steady, moderate pace, but they're very loyal and they're fantastic listeners. So again, reserved but people focused. They really look at the people side of any particular situation. And then the last one here is cautious. I call it the cool blue energy. Again, as you can see, it's at the bottom, but it's on the left. What does that mean? It means that it's a reserved style again because it's at the bottom, but it also means it's task orientated. So the cautious label means that this group of people is very good at analytics, data, processing information, super organized. Under pressure can be seen as a bit aloof, can be a bit skeptical, really likes to deal in facts and figures, but they do have a certain level of sensitivity as well. As I mentioned before, introversion and extroversion, it's about how we see the world, how we process the world. So, for example, the C's and the S's will process internally before articulating, whereas the D and the I styles will articulate first. The way that they create momentum, they go about their work, they ideate is externally. And we need to allow for different styles in different teams because it allows for a blend of styles to work together and different styles to work together, which they all can. I've been doing a lot of work in the finance sector recently across a number of organisations and procurement, and very much you tend to see a lot of styles with the S and the C by the nature of the work they're doing. So that's a bit of an overview of the DISC styles. Now, let's have a look at what happens in conflict. And again, as well as that, the slide that I showed you about the different boxes and way in which you approach conflict, accommodating, collaboration, etc., compromising, there's another way in which we can look at this. And again, with a health warning, we're all unique individuals. What DISC gives you is a baseline for your typical style at work, your style under pressure. It's not everything about you. It may not be, you might dial up different styles, parts of your personality outside of work, but it gives you a baseline. And it's very rare for me to work with people who say, well, none of that sounds like me. And it's usually pretty obvious by the graphs if they've tried to hack the system or hack the algorithm. But let me give you some general parameters around the styles in conflict. I talked about the theory red energy, which is that red energy. And again, in insights, it's similar. That's a person that's very strong-willed, who is quite happy to be in confrontation. They like to get things out in the open, deal with them. Now, it might be a bit of a leap for some of you. If you're more reserved, you could prepare your points. For example, if you are an S style or a C style, what you might want to do is prepare a few succinct points, even the I style, because the I style does tend to talk out loud, which will irritate the D. So keep your points respectful but succinct. And don't be too concerned if they're being quite forthright with you. That's their style. And actually, sometimes it can be quite refreshing to work with somebody who's able to have that open, robust discussion. So that might be something that's a growth opportunity for you. Doesn't mean you have to match their volume or their energy, but it does mean that you need to make your points more succinctly but respectfully. You don't need to give them the detail of how you reach that decision, just what is the end result, what's the end point. Yellow, the sunshine yellow, that outgoing, energetic person. Use a light touch. Try and start with some small talk, ask some personal questions, even though it might feel a bit alien for you, even if it's, how's your day been, Fred? Or how was your weekend? They really like to grease the social wheels before getting into a discussion. Think about where you have this conversation. If it doesn't need to be in a closed room, have a cup of coffee, go out for lunch or something like that. Compliment them. I don't want you to be fake, but try and make a bit of small talk before tackling the issue. And they do like to talk about feelings. Be prepared to listen, that they might come forth with some feelings, and try not to shut it down. Try to let them talk for a bit and say, you could use phrases like, I understand, I completely understand where you're coming from. I can feel that this is really upsetting for you, but what I'm really trying to do is help us to move forward. Those kinds of softer phrases. When we come to the green, they really like harmony. As I mentioned before, they like working together. They can be peacemakers. Now, sometimes the S style can compromise and say, yes, yes, when you're giving them work, yeah, no problem. But on the inside, it's no. So sometimes they can agree to things that they don't really want to do. So make sure that you're going at a steady pace. Show a genuine interest in this person. They're not as outgoing sometimes as the yellow. So be more measured. Don't overwhelm them. Perhaps slow down to a more moderate pace. And find out if there's a compromise, a win-win, a team approach to conflict. And with the blue, what you've got here again is that cool blue energy. They are very organized, quite controlled. They can sometimes be a bit cynical and a bit rigid, and they need to allow people to express their ideas and their thoughts. But do show them some appreciation and outline what is necessary, perhaps from a process perspective, what's needed in the future. Use words such as, well, there's a variable in this equation of how we do this, which I know doesn't sound like a proper sentence, but something like that, which really talks to some of the facts and some of the data. Don't go into personal attack, because they're very reserved and they'll just clam up. They won't really deal with a lot of flooding emotions or outbursts. So try and be really measured around that as well with that particularly reserved style. So just to touch on this is something that I've been using with my clients a lot, and it's a report from DISC, and it's called Productive Conflict. Productive conflict, Sarah, what are you talking about? Yes, it's possible. It's possible to have productive conflict as long as you approach it in the right way. And I would say that even if you agree to disagree, then that can be quite productive in a way. It's all about how you handle yourself and either tear down or build relationships with people you have to work with. I've worked in a lot of big organizations. I've dealt with conflicts myself, and some of them, I remember one on occasion, I had to deal with it in a very assertive manner, which was okay because that's in my wheelhouse. But it was very productive because I was very assertive and clear how the actions of somebody else had made me feel. And that actually helped that person to raise their awareness. They just were not aware of how vocal and aggressive they were being. So it can be a really good source of personal growth if you can do that. I've seen it help my clients to grow. Even if you disagree and can't make a decision, then perhaps it's an opportunity to think about, well, hang on a minute, in this project, are we in the right roles? Have we got the right goals? It might lead to something bigger that's underlying that conflict. So the disproductive conflict report is super duper. I've used it with my clients and they really love it because it looks at your disc style, your baseline personality style, which can be a blend of many different colors, for example, as I talked about before. And it gives you a very personalized report of, okay, this is what you value in a conflict, this is what you fear, this is how, with your specific style, you would need to address conflict with other styles, because this may be where you're defaulting to, but this might not be what's right for the other person. And it gives you so many different parameters in which to analyze and review your conflict methodology, your conflict approach. And conflicts can be, you know, multifaceted between one person. It can be within one team. It can be across teams, so intergroup. It could be across one function and another. We can't agree on this. IT and finance can't agree on something. I don't know why I just picked that, but anyway. Or it can be disagreement within one team, which is normal in the team dynamics piece that I teach my clients on. And as I say, it can be person to person. So this will really help you to understand your conflict style in more detail. But I hope what I've done today is to give you an idea of some of the typical ways in which people tend to address or not conflict, whether you can get a bit of a read on your own style, or at least your leading style from the D, the I, the S, and the C, whether you can get a bit of a read on clients, colleagues, suppliers, and where they're coming from, and maybe just adapt accordingly. So that's the presentation for today. I'm sure I'll be on a live soon. As I mentioned, I'm at the European Leadership Summit tomorrow in Milan. If you are there with the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association, do say hello. If you do have any questions or comments, I'd love to see them when the video gets posted. Feel free to get in touch, drop me a message. And if you're interested in hearing more about productive conflict, the report that I talked about, then just drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye.